Gospel according to
Glory to you, O Lord.
Filled with the Holy Spirit, Jesus returned from the Jordan and was led by the Spirit into the desert for 40 days to be tempted by the devil. He ate nothing during those days, and when they were over, he was hungry. The devil said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command this stone to become bread." Jesus answered him, "It is written, 'One does not live on bread alone.'" Then he took him up and showed him all the kingdoms of the world in a single instant. The devil said to him, "I shall give to you all this power and glory, for it has been handed over to me, and I may give it to whomever I wish. All this will be yours if you worship me." Jesus said to him in reply, "It is written, 'You shall worship the Lord your God, and him alone shall you serve.'" Then he led him to Jerusalem and made him stand on the parapet of the temple and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, 'He will command his angels concerning you to guard you, and with their hands they will support you, lest you dash your foot against a stone.'" Jesus said to him in reply, "It also says, 'You shall not put the Lord your God to the test.'" When the devil had finished every temptation, he departed from him for a time. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
As you can tell, things look a little bit different during Lent. The church asks us to make things more simple and ascetic and penitential during the Lenten season. Right? So we don't have any flowers in the sanctuary, for example. The church rubrics forbid flowers in front of the altar during the season of Lent. The church even asks us that we adjust some of the music, and so that the music during Lent should largely be in support of the voices of the congregation. So we're chanting the responsorial psalm, right? But don't worry, we're not giving up the ambo mic for Lent. I'm not sure why there was an issue with that. Maybe it's because the choir, we've been adjusting our sound system, so maybe there was something that happened with the ambo. But no worries, we will have the ambo mic still during Lent. If you're wondering about the Knights of Columbus this morning, you probably noticed we have a number of them in attendance, and you're all wearing their Knights of Columbus shirts. It's because this Sunday is the Right to Life Sunday, which the Knights of Columbus are asked to celebrate in their parishes, and so I've given them permission to do so. So they'll be the lectors in the EMHCs today, and they led the rosary before Mass. Now, the season of Lent, it's really interesting how every year when Lent starts, we start off with this famous gospel story of Christ, which appears in all three of the Synoptic Gospels. And it's Christ being driven into the wilderness, the desert, to be tested, and to be tempted by the devil. And I always think it's really interesting. Sometimes when we hear this story, we might think that Jesus found himself in the desert by accident, or being tempted by the devil by accident. But the scriptures clearly say that the Holy Spirit himself is the one who inspired this and drove Jesus into the desert. It was all part of Christ's plan. And why? Why was it significant that Christ would do this at the beginning of his ministry, and that the church recalls it for us every year during the season of Lent? It's because Christ wanted to show the devil that even though this may be his world, Christ was coming to take back control. He wanted to show the devil very clearly at the beginning of his ministry that his power was being taken away, given back to its rightful owner. And so Christ, for 40 days, he fasted and prayed, battling temptation, battling the devil. It was a sign that later on in his ministry, when he would take up his cross and the devil would think that he was victorious, it was actually then when his defeat would come. It's a foreshadowing. Christ was setting an example for all of us, that just as he was preparing for his ministry in the desert, battling with the devil, so likewise you and I also have our own desert. And we have to do battle with the devil. And the church specifically sets aside this period of 40 days for us in the church to be in the desert. It's one of the reasons why the church asks us to make everything look so different during the season of Lent. It's a reminder to us. It's supposed to feel like a desert. It's a time in which we try to get rid of distractions. I remember when I was, a few years ago, I was able to do this program called Exodus 90, right, with some of the parishioners here. And it was difficult, right? It was 90 days of asceticism, and we weren't allowed to eat in between meals, we weren't allowed to eat sweets or drink anything with sugar or alcohol or anything like that. And yes, we even were supposed to take lukewarm or cold showers, right, which was always very interesting to see how people would react to that. Right? But the whole point of this program of Exodus, it was a reminder that all of us need to have time in a desert. Not a literal desert, but a spiritual desert, right? Removing distractions. And so we were limited in our cell phone use and our internet use. We were limited in all those different ways with our eating habits, right? And we had to set aside an hour every day for prayer to be in the desert. I also think it's beautiful that the church gives us this reading because it's also a reminder to us of something very important. And that something is that just as Christ was not immune from having to battle the devil, so neither are you and I. Many of you have heard of C.S. Lewis, right? The famous Christian apologist who wrote many books about Christianity. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia and many other things. And C.S. Lewis had this really famous line about the devil. He said the devil basically has two objectives. The first one he's typically much less successful about. One of his objectives is to make people obsess about him or be overly afraid. And so this is not very common. Sometimes people who dabble in the occult and stuff like that, they end up being obsessed in these ways. But C.S. Lewis said his other objective, which he's much more successful in, is he actually tries to convince us that he actually doesn't even exist. That he's not real. The devil is always trying to conceal himself and hide himself out of plain view. An analogy, the devil, I always think of him, he's kind of like a spider, right? Spiders can almost always see you, and you can rarely see them. And spiders wait for their prey, right, to be caught at the moment they least expect it. And then they're trapped. And then the life slowly gets sucked out of them. It's basically what the devil is like. He doesn't want us to realize he exists. He wants to slowly lead us down a path to our destruction. And by the time we realize it, it's too late. When people lose their souls, it doesn't happen in an instant. It's typically a progressive deterioration and fall. Oftentimes it will start with people who have even very good intentions. But the more mistakes they make, they get more and more into the devil's grasp. And again, when it comes to the devil, it's not just a matter of the devil existing somewhere out there. I mean, you and I, we're faithful Catholics. We're part of this beautiful parish, right? Surely the devil is not active here. Far from it. It's exactly the opposite. The people who are already on the outside of the church, the devil doesn't really need to worry about that. But you and I are the ones who are striving to give our lives to Christ and to bring others to Him. So, of course, there's no other place where the devil wants to live than right here, within the church. And indeed, that's the story of the Scriptures. That's the story of the entire Bible. But the devil always has a hidden presence among the people of God, trying to lead to corruption, trying to use the 7 deadly sins to subtly lead people astray. And he can do it with you and I, right? And he often does. And sometimes it's just through basic temptations of trying to lead us into sin. But sometimes it gets to another level, where he starts to take hold in some way. Sometimes people wonder, for example, why are so many parishes shrinking and dying? Is it because people have explicitly given themselves over to evil? Of course not. But it's that in subtle, hidden ways, the devil has taken control. Because of that, many parishes can die, or many people can lose their faith over the course of time. Now, these temptations we hear about in the life of Jesus when he was in the desert. It's really interesting that every temptation the devil tried to give to Christ, it was suddenly hidden under a temptation of pride. As we all know, pride is actually the most serious of all the deadly sins. Pride is the sin for which the devil himself, in the beginning, he himself committed. And yet, I would venture to guess that many of us, when we think about pride, we probably don't even realize just how much pride can affect us. Typically when you ask somebody what their most serious sin is, right, they'll talk about somebody who they haven't forgiven, or they'll talk about a sin of lust, right, or somebody they're jealous of, or something like that. Rarely do people think about the sin of pride. And again, that's exactly the way the devil wants it. He doesn't want us to see how prideful we can become in many areas. Now, I'll give you an example, right? A few examples really of pride. One of the most common ways that pride can take hold of our lives, or they perish, is when we have a sense of control, or an over-exaggerated sense of control. Sometimes we can get upset when things are not going the way we think they should be going, or sometimes we can take up responsibilities in a church or in a family, right? And when that responsibility starts to be given to somebody else, it starts to build this frustration in us. Kind of a silly example of this is when I was in seminary, I was in a bluegrass band, right, with some other seminarians. It was kind of funny. We called ourselves Celibate Rage. And, we were actually, I think the band was pretty good, but, this was before I could play the banjo or the mandolin or anything, so, they needed a percussionist, so I was the washboard player. And I played the washboard, and I had the egg shakers, right, and everything else in percussion, and, of course, in my heart of hearts, I knew that they didn't really need me, right? But I wanted to feel like, I'm the percussionist. And many of the band members, they were at a different seminary from me, and I remember I saw a video of them performing at one of the concerts at their university. And sure enough, one of my brother seminarians was up there with them with the egg shakers. He became the percussionist in my absence. And I could just feel something inside of me, right? I'm the percussionist. That's just a silly example, but something that can creep in to all of us. Especially since many of us in a parish, Oftentimes, people will take on responsibilities in a church, and they sacrifice a lot of time and effort. And so sometimes when the control gets to start being taken away, it can build up this anxiety and anguish. Now, what are some other ways that we can give into the sin of pride? One of the ways that we can give into the sin of pride is by complaining too much. Again, with this sense of control. Again, one of the beautiful things about the season of Lent is that the church specifically makes things more penitential for us. The Mass is supposed to feel less beautiful, less glorious. It's a reminder. And it's good for us sometimes, for the Mass to not be how we want it to be. I'm not immune to this either, right? There's plenty of things that I have to do as a priest because the church tells us to that I wish would be different. Or sometimes people can complain and become resentful about something a committee has decided, or the pastor has decided, the bishop has decided, and again, I'm just as guilty of this as anybody else. But it's very important that in the church, one of the central virtues the church asks us to do is to be obedient, teaching us to be humble. It's not my parish, it's the church's parish. It doesn't belong to anyone else. And sometimes that can be really hard. Again, I remember a few years back I had a pastor who I was assigned with who was making a lot of decisions that I really was uncomfortable with. And I thought he was making a lot of mistakes, and I remember I got really resentful about it, and I was trying to complain as much as I could, and I remember one of the old priests in the diocese, he finally told me after a number of months of this, he said, at the end of the day, you might disagree with what the bishop is doing, what your pastor is doing, but at the end of the day, it's not your decision to make. And so why are you allowing yourself to be so resentful about this? It's not in your hands. Again, we can all fall into that in different times, whether it's at work, or maybe it's a committee we're a part of, and of course at any parish. We can all fall into that sin of clinging to that control, holding on to resentment. Another way that we can fall into the sin of pride, we can become complacent in our faith. Again, think about the number one objective of the devil: to lead people astray, to conceal himself. What better way for him to lead people astray than by people in our church becoming completely complacent in their faith? Never taking the time to grow, to spend time in prayer, to spend time learning, to get involved in some way as a leader in the church or in some ministry. Many of us can go months and even years at a time without actually taking any steps forward in our faith. This isn't just adults. I would say this to our youth as well. One of the tragedies in our church is that so often when youth go through the sacrament of confirmation, right, how do they see it? It's the graduation. I'm done now. It's supposed to be the opposite. It's the beginning. It's the launching pad of your life given in service to the church. And yet so many of us, we can allow ourselves to become complacent in our relationship with God and in our prayer and in our learning. Now, these are just some of the subtle ways, and there's so many more examples that can be given. But make no mistake about it. The devil is very present and active in the life of every Christian and in the life of every parish. And oftentimes it's in ways that we don't even recognize, which is exactly the way he wants it. I pray that this season of Lent, as we reflect on these temptations in the desert, it might be a time for all of us to reflect on how we need to grow in humility, letting go of the sin of the